The howling wind tore at Margaret Collins' woolen cloak as she urged her exhausted mare through knee-deep snow. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and her fingers had long since lost feeling inside her threadbare gloves. The Colorado mountains loomed around her like silent sentinels, indifferent to her struggle. 3 days of relentless blizzard had transformed the familiar trail into a treacherous white void. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret clutched her medical bag, containing everything she'd managed to salvage from the fire, and squinted against the blinding white, searching for any sign of shelter in this merciless January of 1882. "Just a little further, Penny," she whispered to the struggling horse, her voice instantly swallowed by the wind. "We'll find somewhere soon." But sometimes hope freezes faster than flesh in a mountain blizzard, and Margaret Collins was about to discover how quickly dreams of service could turn to desperate survival. The blizzard had descended without warning 3 days earlier, transforming the clear winter sky into a churning mass of grey fury. Margaret had been halfway between settlements when the first heavy flakes began to fall. She'd been traveling to Pinecrest, answering their urgent request for a trained nurse after influenza had swept through the mining town. 32 years old and unmarried, Margaret had built her reputation as one of the most dedicated traveling nurses in the Colorado Territory. The daughter of a Boston physician, she had defied her family's expectations by heading west after completing her nursing training at Massachusetts General Hospital. 5 years of service in frontier towns had hardened her to difficult conditions, but nothing had prepared her for the devastating fire that had destroyed the clinic in Silver Creek 2 weeks earlier, claiming the life of Dr. Henderson and leaving her without employment or lodging. The letter from Pinecrest had seemed like providence, a chance to start fresh, to be needed again. The town council had promised modest but adequate accommodations and a small stipend in exchange for her medical expertise. It wasn't the comfortable life her family had envisioned for her, but it was purpose, and that was all Margaret had ever wanted. Now, as the 3rd day of her journey through the blizzard drew to a close, purpose seemed a luxury compared to survival. Her supplies were nearly gone, her strength fading. Penny stumbled beneath her, the exhausted mare struggling to continue. Margaret's medical training told her what she didn't want to acknowledge. Without shelter soon, neither of them would survive the night. "Please," she whispered, though to whom she wasn't certain. Her father's stern God seemed as distant as the sun behind the storm clouds. "Please, just a cabin, a cave, anything." As if in answer, Penny raised her head, ears pricking forward. The mare changed direction slightly, her pace quickening despite her fatigue. Margaret didn't question this sudden determination, simply leaning forward and giving the horse her head. Through the curtain of swirling snow, a dark shape gradually materialized, too angular to be natural, too purposeful to be accident. A cabin. Hope surged through Margaret's frozen limbs. "Good girl, Penny," she managed through cracked lips. "You've found it." As they drew closer, details emerged. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, solidly built of dark timber with a stone chimney. No smoke rose from it, but the structure itself offered protection from the relentless wind. Margaret practically fell from the saddle, her legs buckling as she hit the ground. She stumbled toward what appeared to be a small lean-to attached to the cabin. Not ideal, but shelter enough for Penny. After securing the exhausted mare with fumbling fingers, Margaret approached the cabin's front door. Propriety demanded she knock, though the absence of smoke suggested vacancy. Her numb hand formed a fist, rapping weakly against the wooden door. When no response came, she tried the handle, relief washing over her as it turned beneath her palm. The interior was dark and cold, but blessedly still after the howling chaos outside. Margaret closed the door behind her, leaning against it as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The cabin was a single large room, simply but thoughtfully furnished. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, neatly stacked with wood and kindling ready. To light, a table and chairs stood in the center, bookshelves lined another wall, and a bed occupied the far corner. It was clearly someone's home, clean, ordered, lived in, but currently empty. Margaret's conscience pricked at the intrusion, but survival outweighed courtesy. She would explain when the owner returned, would offer compensation or service. For now, she needed warmth. With hands that shook from cold and exhaustion, Margaret set about lighting the fire. Years on the frontier had taught her practical skills her Boston upbringing had neglected. Soon, a small flame caught in the kindling, gradually growing as she carefully added larger pieces of wood. The spreading warmth brought pain as her frozen extremities began to thaw, but she welcomed it as the price of survival. Only when the fire was crackling steadily did Margaret allow herself to truly look around the cabin. Details that had escaped her initial assessment now emerged. Medical texts lined the bookshelves alongside volumes of poetry and natural history. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, neatly labeled and organized. A desk beneath the window held papers, writing implements, and what appeared to be patient records. This was a doctor's cabin. Margaret felt a curious mixture of relief and professional curiosity. Whoever lived here was a medical practitioner of some kind, which explained the isolated location, positioned to serve scattered homesteads and settlements. The thought brought comfort. Surely a fellow healer would understand her predicament. A wave of dizziness reminded Margaret that she hadn't eaten since morning. She hesitated, reluctant to impose further on an absent stranger's hospitality. But necessity overcame reservation. The small pantry yielded dried beans, cornmeal, and jerky, frontier staples designed to last through winter isolation. She allowed herself a small portion of jerky and set beans to soak in a pot of melting snow. As warmth gradually returned to her body, exhaustion took its place. Margaret knew she should check on Penny again, but her limbs felt leaden, her thoughts increasingly foggy. Just a few minutes of rest by the fire, she told herself, sinking into a chair nearby, just enough to gather strength. Her eyes drifted closed against her will, the crackle of the fire becoming a distant lullaby. Margaret didn't notice when her head tilted forward or when the half-eaten jerky fell from her slack fingers. Consciousness slipped away as the blizzard continued its assault outside, unaware and uncaring of the woman who had narrowly escaped its deadly embrace. How long she slept, Margaret couldn't tell. She woke to the sensation of being watched. Opening her eyes required monumental effort, her lids feeling weighted with lead. When she finally managed to raise them, her vision was blurred, the cabin swimming around her. But one thing stood clear, a figure by the door, tall and motionless, observing her with unreadable intensity. Fear shot through her, providing momentary clarity. The figure was a man, broad-shouldered and imposing in a snow-dusted coat. Long black hair framed a face of striking angles, high cheekbones, straight nose, strong jaw. His skin was the warm brown of polished cedar, his eyes so dark they appeared black in the firelight. "You have a fever," he said, his voice deep and accented with something Margaret couldn't place. It wasn't a question, but a diagnosis. "I'm sorry," she managed, her own voice barely a whisper. "The storm. I had nowhere else." She tried to stand, to explain properly, but the room tilted alarmingly around her. The man moved then, crossing to her in 2 swift strides and pressing her gently back into the chair. His hand on her shoulder was firm but careful, a healer's touch. Up close, Margaret could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes, lines of experience at their corners. "Be still," he instructed, kneeling before her to examine her face. His fingers, surprisingly warm against her skin, tilted her chin towards the firelight. "Your horse is safe. I've moved her into the proper stable." Relief flooded through Margaret. "Thank you. Penny's a good mare. She found your cabin somehow." The man nodded, still studying her with clinical detachment. "Animals often have better sense than people. You should not have been traveling in this weather." Despite her condition, Margaret felt a flicker of indignation. "I had little choice. The clinic in Silver Creek burned down. I was answering Pinecrest's call for a nurse." Something shifted in the man's expression, surprise perhaps, or reassessment. He reached for her wrist, fingers finding her pulse point with practiced ease. "You're a nurse?" "Yes. Margaret Collins. I trained at Massachusetts General." He studied her face more intently now, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "I am Daniel Blackfeather," he said after a moment. "This is my clinic." The name tugged at Margaret's memory, stories heard in passing during her years in the territory. "Dr. Blackfeather, the one they call—" She stopped herself, suddenly uncertain if the moniker was considered respectful. "The half-breed doctor," he finished for her, his tone matter-of-fact. "Yes, that is what some call me." Margaret flushed with embarrassment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I apologize, I didn't mean—" "No need," he interrupted, releasing her wrist and standing in a fluid motion. "Your pulse is rapid, your temperature elevated. How long were you in the storm?" Grateful for the return to medical matters, Margaret tried to focus. 3 days, I think. The blizzard caught me on the pass." Dr. Blackfeather's expression darkened. 3 days in these conditions. You're suffering from exposure and the beginnings of pneumonia, I suspect." He moved to the shelves, selecting dried herbs with decisive movements. "You need treatment and rest. Pinecrest will have to wait." Margaret wanted to protest. She had obligations, promises made. But another wave of dizziness washed over her, and she slumped in the chair. Perhaps he was right. She couldn't help anyone if she arrived half-dead from illness. "I can pay," she offered weakly, gesturing to her medical bag. "It's not much, but—" Dr. Blackfeather glanced at her, something like wry amusement crossing his features. "I do not charge fellow healers, Miss Collins." He worked methodically, preparing an infusion from the herbs he'd selected. The scent that rose from the pot hanging over the fire was unfamiliar to Margaret. Earthy and pungent, nothing like the medicines she'd trained with. Her medical curiosity stirred despite her condition. "What are you brewing?" "My mother's remedy," he replied, stirring the mixture. "Elderberry, yarrow, and plants your medical texts don't name." "Your mother was a healer too." A complex emotion crossed his face. "She was medicine woman to her people. The Comanche have different ways of healing than your Boston doctors." He poured the steaming liquid into a cup and brought it to her. "Drink. It will help the fever and ease your breathing." Margaret hesitated only briefly before accepting the cup. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, warming her from within as she sipped. "Thank you, Dr. Blackfeather." He nodded acknowledgement, then moved to turn down the bed in the corner. "You need proper rest. The chair will only make your condition worse." Margaret glanced at the bed, then back at him, sudden awareness of their situation bringing color to her already feverish cheeks. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she'd just met. Propriety had definite opinions about such circumstances. Dr. Blackfeather seemed to read her thoughts. "I have patients to check on," he said, his tone professional. "The Wilson's infant has croup, and old man Jenkins broke his leg last week. I will return tomorrow, weather permitting." He gestured to the bed. "That is yours until you recover. I often sleep in the treatment room at the back." The tension in Margaret's shoulders eased slightly. "You're going out in this storm. It's dangerous." "The trail to the Wilson homestead is familiar to me and my horse," he replied, already, gathering supplies into a leather bag similar to her own. "Their cabin is only 2 miles east. Jenkins is beyond, but I can shelter there if necessary." As he prepared to leave, Margaret finished the medicinal tea, already feeling its effects, spreading through her system. Her breathing seemed easier, the painful tightness in her chest loosening slightly. "Your remedy is effective," she admitted. "I've never seen these combinations used before." Dr. Blackfeather paused in his preparations, studying her with that same unreadable intensity. "There is wisdom in both our traditions, Miss Collins. Neither has all the answers alone." He placed a kettle of water near the fire and indicated more herbs laid out on the table. "Make another infusion in 4 hours. There is food in the pantry. Rest as much as possible." With that, he donned his heavy coat and hat, collected his medical bag, and moved to the door. The blast of cold air as he opened it made Margaret shiver. "Dr. Blackfeather," she called, causing him to pause at the threshold. "Thank you." He regarded her silently for a moment, snow swirling around his tall figure. Then, with a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or merely farewell, he stepped out into the storm, pulling the door firmly closed behind him. Left alone, Margaret found herself studying the cabin with renewed interest. The integration of Western medicine and native healing practices was evident everywhere she looked. Modern surgical instruments stored alongside ceremonial items, anatomy texts shelved next to what appeared to be hand-drawn botanical guides. 2 worlds merged seamlessly in this small space, just as they did in the man himself. Despite her best intentions to remain awake, exhaustion and illness soon overcame her. The herbal remedy had eased her symptoms enough that sleep beckoned. Irresistibly, Margaret barely managed to make it to the bed before consciousness fled once more. Her dreams were fever-bright and strange. Snow-covered mountains that breathed like living beings, herbs that whispered their properties in voices like rustling leaves, and throughout, a presence that watched over her with dark, knowing eyes. When Margaret next woke, weak winter sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows. The blizzard had passed, at least temporarily, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. She felt marginally better, still weak and feverish, but more clear-headed than before. True to his word, Dr. Blackfeather was absent, though the fire had been built up recently, suggesting he had returned and left again while she slept. A pot of the medicinal tea sat warming by the hearth, and a bowl of what appeared to be corn porridge waited on the table, covered to keep warm. The thoughtfulness of these preparations touched Margaret unexpectedly. She was accustomed to caring for others, not being cared for herself. With effort, she rose from the bed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. Her legs trembled beneath her as she made her way to the table, but they supported her weight, a good sign. The porridge was simple but nourishing, flavored with dried berries and a hint of honey. Margaret ate slowly, conscious of her weakened state. As she finished, the door opened, admitting Dr. Blackfeather, along with a gust of cold air. Snow dusted his dark hair and coat, but he appeared otherwise unaffected by conditions that would have felled many men. "You're awake," he observed, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. "Good. How is your breathing?" "Better," Margaret replied truthfully. "Your remedy helped considerably." He nodded, unsurprised. "It will take several days for the infection to clear completely. You must not rush your recovery." "I can't impose on you for days," she protested. "Pinecrest is expecting me. They need a nurse urgently." Dr. Blackfeather regarded her steadily as he warmed his hands by the fire. "Pinecrest has sent word that the pass is closed. Even if you were well, you could not reach them now." Margaret's heart sank. "They sent word? When?" "A messenger reached me yesterday evening while you slept. The town has arranged for a doctor from Denver until conditions improve." He paused, studying her reaction. "This disappoints you." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. That position was to be my new start. She gestured vaguely, encompassing her circumstances. The fire in Silver Creek took everything, my lodgings, my supplies, my livelihood. Understanding flickered in Dr. Blackfeather's dark eyes. So you risked your life crossing a mountain pass in winter because you had nowhere else to go. Put so bluntly, it sounded foolish, even to her own ears. It sounds reckless when you phrase it that way. It was reckless, he agreed, but without judgment, though I understand necessity. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such choices. Margaret found herself curious about the path that had led a Half-Comanche man to practice medicine in this remote mountain region, how he had bridged two worlds that so often stood in violent opposition. "How did you become a doctor?" she asked, then immediately regretted the forwardness of the question. "I'm sorry, that's rather personal." To her surprise, Dr. Blackfeather didn't seem offended. He moved to check the contents of the kettle, adding more herbs to the water. "My father was a cavalry surgeon," he said after a moment. "He met my mother when her village was relocated after the treaties of 1865. His tone remained neutral, though Margaret sensed carefully controlled emotion beneath the surface. She was a healer among her people. He recognized her gift, respected her knowledge when few white men would. He stirred the mixture slowly, methodically. They taught me both traditions. When I was old enough, my father arranged my formal medical training at a school in Chicago that would accept me." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. One of very few that would. Margaret absorbed this information, imagining the challenges he must have faced. "And you chose to practice here?" "In the mountains? I chose to practice where I could be of use," he corrected, "and where my methods would not be questioned too closely by those who believe medicine must come only from books and laboratories." He poured a cup of the steaming liquid and brought it to her. "Here, people care more about results than where the doctor's knowledge originates." Margaret accepted the cup, inhaling the aromatic steam. "The integration of different healing traditions is fascinating. During my training, we were taught that native remedies were mere superstition." Dr. Blackfeather's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps resigned acceptance of such attitudes. "Many of your modern medicines come from plants my mother's people used for generations," he said quietly. "The difference is that your doctors extract single components and discard the rest, while traditional healers understand that plants work in concert, balancing and supporting each other's properties." Margaret considered this perspective, one she'd never encountered in her formal training. Would you be willing to teach me some of these methods while I recover? I've always believed in continuing my education." For the first time, genuine surprise registered on Dr. Blackfeather's face. He studied her with renewed interest, as if seeing beyond the surface of the feverish white woman who had stumbled into his cabin. "Most trained nurses would consider such knowledge beneath them," he observed. "I consider no knowledge that helps. Patients beneath me," Margaret countered. "I've seen too much suffering to be proud about where healing comes from." Something shifted in Dr. Blackfeather's demeanor, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes, an easing of the professional distance he maintained. "Rest today," he said, moving toward his desk. "If your fever lessens by tomorrow, perhaps we can begin with the basic principles of herbal combinations." He glanced back at her, that almost smile touching his lips again. "Though I warn you, Miss Collins, my mother was a demanding teacher. I am no different." Margaret found herself smiling in return, the first genuine smile since the fire had upended her life. "I'm considered quite stubborn, Dr. Blackfeather. Ask anyone who knows me." "Daniel," he said after a moment's consideration. "If we are to Work together, even temporarily. You should call me Daniel. Then you must call me Margaret, she replied, feeling as though some significant boundary had been crossed, though she couldn't have named it precisely. He nodded once, accepting. This exchange is a contract of sorts. Rest now, Margaret. Your body needs time to heal. As he turned to his own work, Margaret settled back in the chair, cradling the warm cup between her hands. Outside, the Colorado wilderness lay silent under its blanket of snow, beautiful and deadly. Inside, she had found unexpected shelter, not just from the storm, but perhaps from the uncertainty that had plagued her since the fire. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, or where she would go when she recovered. But for the first time since watching the Silver Creek Clinic burn to ashes, Margaret Collins felt the stirring of possibility. The sense that this blizzard, this illness, this chance encounter with the remarkable Dr. Daniel Blackfeather might not be misfortune after all, but the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. The weeks that followed transformed both Margaret and Daniel in ways neither could have anticipated. As her strength returned, Margaret proved to be a quick study, absorbing Daniel's teachings about traditional remedies while sharing her own expertise in surgical techniques and patient care. Together, they created a seamless blend of practices that drew patients from settlements far beyond their mountain community. Their first real test came when pneumonia swept through the nearby mining camp. The miners, distrustful of both female nurses and native medicine, initially resisted their help. But as conventional treatments failed and men began dying, desperation overcame prejudice. "They won't trust me," Daniel had said, preparing his medicines in the cabin, "but they might accept you." Margaret had squared her shoulders, determination hardening her features. "Then I'll go first, and when they see our methods work, they'll accept us both." She had been right. The combination of her professional manner and his effective remedies gradually won over even the most skeptical patients. By the third day, miners were openly asking for the doctor and his nurse as a team, no longer distinguishing between whose knowledge had saved them. "You changed their minds," Daniel observed one evening as they rode back to the cabin, exhaustion weighing on them both after treating 16 patients in a single day. "We changed their minds," Margaret corrected. "Together." That word, together, had begun appearing in their conversations with increasing frequency, a reminder of the unique partnership they had forged through necessity and sustained through mutual respect. As the harsh winter gave way to the first tentative shoots of spring, Margaret's health had fully returned. The snow in the mountain passes began to melt, opening routes to other settlements, including Pinecrest, where she had originally been headed when the blizzard struck. The night before her scheduled departure, Daniel found her organizing herbs in the clinic they now shared, her movements betraying an uncharacteristic hesitation. "The Wilsons asked after you today," he said, his deep voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Their baby is thriving thanks to your modified croup treatment." Margaret smiled, remembering the infant's first clear breath after days of struggling. "Your mother's steam technique combined with my respiratory protocol worked perfectly. I've documented the approach for the Pinecrest Clinic." Daniel moved to the workbench beside her, his presence familiar now in a way that made her heart quicken. "We work well together," he observed quietly. "We do," she agreed, finally meeting his gaze, surprised to find uncertainty in his usually confident eyes. "Pinecrest will be fortunate to have you," he said, though something in his expression belied the generosity of his words. Margaret set down the herbs she'd been sorting. "I've received a letter from Pinecrest. Dr. Harrison from Denver has settled there permanently. They no longer need me." "I see," Daniel said carefully. "And where will you go now?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibility. "I was hoping I might stay," Margaret replied, courage gathering in her chest. "This valley needs both of us. These people, they need what we can offer together." "Together," Daniel repeated, the word carrying more meaning now than ever before. Yes, your knowledge of traditional medicine combined with my training. We've already seen what's possible. She hesitated, then added more softly, if you'll have me as your partner. Partner, Daniel echoed, stepping closer. His hand brushed hers among the dried herbs, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. In the clinic, you mean? Margaret looked up at him, reading the real question in his dark eyes. In the clinic, she confirmed, then with a steadying breath, added, and in all things, if you wish it. The silence that followed seemed to stretch an eternity, broken only by the crackle of the fire and their matched breathing. I have wished it, Daniel finally said, his voice rich with emotion usually kept carefully contained. Since the day you questioned my herbal combinations and suggested improvements no white healer had ever considered. Margaret laughed softly, relief and joy bubbling up. That long? For me, it was when you traveled through that second blizzard to reach the Peterson childbirth. When he took her hand fully in his, it felt like the most natural conclusion to the journey that had begun. In the blizzard's fury, the cabin that had once been her desperate shelter had become home. The man whose differences had initially seemed so stark had become the other half of something remarkable, a bridge between worlds, between traditions, between hearts. Their marriage that autumn caused a stir throughout the territory. Some disapproved, including Margaret's family back east, who wrote a coldly formal letter expressing their disappointment. But for every critic, there were twice as many supporters, patients whose lives had been saved by their combined approach, communities that had learned to see beyond prejudice to the healing gifts they shared. The wedding itself honored both, their traditions. Margaret wore her mother's lace veil alongside beaded jewelry crafted by women from Daniel's mother's tribe. They spoke vows in English and Comanche, binding themselves together under both Christian scripture and native blessings. Within 2 years, their clinic had grown renowned throughout Colorado territory for its unprecedented success rates and innovative approaches. Doctors from as far as San Francisco and Chicago came to study their methods, at first skeptically, then with growing respect. They said it couldn't be done, Margaret remarked one evening, watching a medical colleague from Denver carefully copying their formulations. That traditional wisdom and modern medicine could never truly work together. Daniel smiled, the expression no longer rare on his handsome face. They said the same about us. What had begun as a desperate bid for survival in a mountain blizzard had transformed into a pioneering partnership that would change frontier medicine forever, proving that healing gifts, like love, often flourish most powerfully when different worlds find their common ground. Up next, you've got 2 more stand out. Stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.